Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Maynard Falkenberg. It is an honor for me to welcome all of you to this very special lecture session that the Institute and the art history session of our campus is organizing. We are very thankful that Mariët Westermann has been willing to address us in her capacity as a scholar of Dutch 17th century art. Most of you know Mariët Westermann in other capacities than as the internationally renowned scholar of Dutch 17th century painting she actually is. To introduce her to you in regard of these capacities is, of course, futile. Many of us know her well, not only as the new Vice-Chancellor of NYUAD Dhabi, but also as the first provost of our liberal arts college, who stood at the very roots of this enterprise long before this campus was built, faculty and staff were hired, and the curriculum developed. Today I will just say a few words about the outstanding scholarship I'm confident she will give testimony of in today's lecture on the emergence of the lemon twist in Dutch 17th century still life painting. Professor Westermann has published many books, articles, essays, book reviews over the many, many years, too many to mention here. I mention a few highlights. First of all, there was this marvelous book called The Amusements of Jan Steen, a genre painter, famous genre painter of the 17th century, which she published in 1997. A year before, actually, she had already published a major survey textbook with the title A Worldly Art, the Dutch Republic, 1585 to 1718, which is still up to date, a very well-renowned and well-sold textbook I find all over the place in the world, to be honest. She published a monograph or monographs on several key artists of the 17th century, the Dutch 17th century, one of which is a monograph on Rembrandt, on his art and ideas, which was published in the year 2000. She published a monograph on Johannes Vermeer, the painter of the girl with the pearl ring. Everyone knows that painter. She authored and co-curated several exhibitions, one of which had the title Art and Home, Dutch Interiors in the Age of Rembrandt in 2001. She's actually made many contributions to important international exhibitions. Mention just a few. Again, on this important genre painter Jan Steen in the National Gallery and the Amsterdam Rijksmuseum in 1996, on Rembrandt in the Garden Museum in Boston in 2000, on another genre painter, Minse Molenaar, in the Raleigh Museum of Art in 2002, again on Vermeer in the Prado Museum in Madrid, and again on Vermeer and Rembrandt in the Rijksmuseum. So her international stature and importance is just illuminated by this short list of outstanding contributions to the field. She's also written on and edited books and articles on broad methodological issues, much broader than on Dutch art. And I would like to mention here her edited book on anthropologies of art, which she edited when she was an important functionary at the Clark Art Institute in the US in 2005, and I found today, I didn't know, a small book that she co-authored with Hilary Ballon called Art History and its Publications in the Electronic Age of 2006, which shows you the breadth of her interest, scholarly interest. And an article recently I saw on the humanities in the age of information and post-truth. We set aside what that post-truth means. She has been on the editorial board of important journals, and her publications and interests go way beyond art and cultural history. She has an interest in science, in social history, in museum studies, and in the position of the humanities at large. To come back to Jan Steen, in 1996, I bought this book, it's dated, so it's now 24 years ago, that contains an article by Professor Westermann on this artist Jan Steen. This is a typical humorous painter of humorous, very humorous, ironic, staged settings of social life in the Netherlands in the 17th century. It contains a 14-page essay on the art of this painter, and it talks about the relationship between Steen's comic art, contemporary theater, literary culture, the rhetoricians, social commentary and morality, artistic ambition and competition, and art as a conversation piece, all in one essay of 14 pages. And this is if you're retaking, that she is a pilot of an airplane that you enter, and she takes you on a huge, high flight, 10,000 meters high, and you have a fantastic oversight of what's going on in artistic circles in the 17th century. And then she descends down to the smallest details, such as lemon peels. And all is woven together in a fantastic, harmonious story with a multitude of perspectives. And I'm so glad, not to use another word, that she's with us today to give you another example of her scholarship. Please welcome Mariët Westermann to the floor.
Wow. Thank you so much, Maynard Falkenberg, friend and collaborator and fellow art historian of many, many years, and also NYUAD Abu Dhabi man of the first hour. It's really, I'm very grateful for everything you just said. I'm especially grateful because it is such a great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, and students. It is such a great pleasure to speak as a scholar this evening at the NYUAD Abu Dhabi Institute, which is, of course, our public forum started 12 years ago for the best ideas in and outside the academy. And to speak in my own institution, NYUAD Abu Dhabi, which, as you heard from Reinhard, I'm a very curious person. I'm sort of curious George. And this is a university that values that kind of curiosity. And it is really committed to an integrated vision of knowledge production and dissemination, where studies in art, science, engineering, and society can be brought back together, just as they are often together out in the world. There was a time in European history, in Western history, when knowledge was like that, when knowledge was integrated, or it had integrated ambitions. And that was in the Renaissance chambers of curiosities that had this aspiration to contain the better to understand all the knowledge in the world. And they did so in the form of objects and images, in the form of natural specimens, minerals, antiquities, and works of art. And you see a classic example here from an image of 1555 of such a chamber of curiosity, of such an early museum, the so-called museum of a man named Ole Worm, a scientist and antiquarian in Copenhagen. It is unusual today to have a university dedicate so much of its mind share to the question of what we can all learn across fields of inquiry, from within and outside our disciplines. And that seems to me a very important thing to do in an age that is crying out for collaborative solutions to pressing problems of our time. It is also not so common in my experience of universities to have scientists, engineers, social scientists, philosophers, literary scholars, and historians, and I see all of you here, pay so much attention to what they may learn from their colleagues in the arts, from their work, the work of scholars of art and artists who work with images, sound, and craft practices that are not in the first place textual or mathematical. Words and numbers can help us understand them, but they are not in the first place textual or mathematical. And most universities, as we know, are very logocentric and quantitative in orientation. That's not a bad thing. I'm not against that at all, but there is more one can learn from the arts. And research in the arts, I would say, can balance those preoccupations of our society and our universities in our digital and globalized age. And I think the arts can help bring out the human intentionality of the individual and the collective in all we do. So my talk tonight about the history of citrus fruit in painting is an example of such object-driven, art-driven inquiry. I think it may seem a very esoteric topic to you, and I admit it is a little bit. But I chose it as an example of one that rewards curiosity in its own right, that rewards a certain willingness to play with knowledge that at first may seem a little useless, perhaps. And it benefits from research across borders, the way we often conduct here at NYUAD Dhabi. So let's go. This is the first painting I remember seeing consciously as a painted thing. A still life by Willem Heda, made in 1635. My mother had dropped me off at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, I grew up near there, because she needed to attend to my grandmother for something. I must have been about 11 or 12 at the time, which is about the age that the Dutch set their kids loose on the town. I don't know if they still do today, but they did then. It was a wonderful thing. I don't remember much of what I saw and did that day, but I recall very vividly turning a corner in the building and this painting suddenly holding my attention. I thought something like this: wow, they hang photographs in this museum? I was actually even a little dismissive of it because at the time, in the early 70s, one didn't hang so many photographs in museums. Now we do. And when I came close to the painting, I realized that those glistening little light reflections that you see on the edges of those pewter dishes that seem to hang over the table at the front, that those light reflections actually dissolve into white paint. And I saw that the waxy little nubs you see on the lemon's rind and these dry filaments of its flesh, which is known as pith, that white pith on the inside of the rind, that those nubs actually rose up a little bit, not like a photograph. They rose up on the surface of the painting against that very smooth green tablecloth behind. And I even noticed that this twist, this lemon twist, threw a shadow on that cloth. Can you see that? It seemed an amazing thing to me. I was a child, I really had no words for this, of course, but the skill to make paint look like these other materials and optical phenomena, I remember it seemed unfathomable and really, really hard. How did he do it? As I became a historian of art many years later, I saw so many peeled lemons in Dutch still life paintings that I didn't give their presence another thought, really. I only came to see the motif as significant, possibly, and demanding of an explanation, as strange, 2 decades ago, when I heard a lecture by a remarkable historian of art and of images named David Friedberg. He's an art historian to this day at that other university in New York, that little place called Columbia University, but he's a very good one. And he gave a lecture. This historian of art gave a lecture about the natural history of citrus fruit in 17th century Rome. I put this in for Fabio. At the time I heard that lecture about citrus fruit and the natural history in the 17th century, I was trying to understand the art historical problem that actually seemed unrelated. I was studying how, in the growing art market in the Netherlands in the 17th century, which we'll talk more about, there was a flourishing art market, I had noticed that Dutch artists were constantly picking up each other's pictorial inventions and very quickly turning them around. The artist Reiner just mentioned of my dissertation, Jan Steen, was brilliant at this. He was the ultimate robber of the ideas of others and the recirculator. So I was interested in how this came about, that people took up those pictorial inventions and turned them around in a year or less. As I listened to the citrus lecture, I thought the repetitious lemon could be such a trope. But at the time, those market questions took me in other directions, and I let the lemon sit. More recently, however, in the last 5 years or so, as we have in the discipline of art history become very focused on global histories of trade and on the integration of art and science as a key to innovation today in our society and economies, I have returned to this question of the lemon. Particularly, I returned first to the question of whether there was a convergence between these Roman citrus studies that I'll tell you about and the contemporaneous rise of the lemon in Dutch still life painting. This talk today will seek to answer why there are so many lemons in Dutch paintings, and especially still life. And then it will ask how they came to be peeled like that. Did Dutch advances in botany and horticulture at the time shape this motif, this meme? Or did the market for luxury commodities make it somehow inevitable? And what was in it for artists? Why did painters go after it? So the talk will proceed in 3 parts. I was very classically trained. I always do things in 3s. First, I will look at the general circulation in the 17th century of these new visual ideas on this Dutch art market. And then I will try to sketch the rise of citrus in science, commerce, and art in Europe and the Netherlands. And then in the last section, we will trace the genesis and the destiny of the peeled lemon in painting. So part 1, motifs and markets. 17th century Dutch painting is rife with instances of artists recycling their own motifs and others picking them up and doing other things with them. And this is especially true for still life painting. And I think that is because painters who specialized in still life, these assemblages of objects, often rearranged the very props that they owned. We know that from their inventories. This table and not that one, and so forth. This vase, not that one. They never just painted an arrangement that they happened to come upon and see hanging out somewhere. They really staged these things in their studio with their own things. And so it stood to reason that these things would start to get repeated, especially if they were expensive. So let's look at this artist, Willem Heda, who repeated motifs of visual interest that appear to have sold well, as in the case of the silver tazza. The silver tazza is that dish. There's one, and there's another one, basically the same one. And not only does he paint it relentlessly, he also always flips it over as if nobody ever had that thing upright on their table. It's a curious thing. But he did it time and again, and it clearly was successful. This is called the silver tazza. This is an Italian dish tipped over on its side. And these 2 very similar still life paintings are of 1633 and of 1635, and I could have shown you 10 others in that rough period of the 30s. It became a trademark for Heda. Heda may have passed this tippy silver dish along to Pieter Claesz. Pieter Claesz, who was his fellow citizen in Haarlem, and Haarlem was a great city of painters. We'll come back to that. And so you see that there's Pieter Claesz saying, oh, that looks good, 1635, I'll do that. I can do that too. Before long, the tazza became all the rage. It ended up showing up in paintings of a wide range of themes and quality. And you can see that, right? Here you have these 2 again, and then not so long thereafter, these 2 artists collaborated, and there you see it again. And if you look closely at how this perspective is handled here, you can sort of see there is a bit of a quality differential. I don't think you have to be a trained art historian to see that not everybody handles these motifs equally well, although it's a very, very competent painting. The rapid emergence and the broad circulation of a limited number of objects in Dutch painting, singled out from all the possible things that one could possibly paint, is really extraordinary when you think about it for an age that didn't have photography, that didn't have motorized transport or modern media that could spread such ideas quickly. If this were on the internet, of course you would see it all the time, you could imagine. But you have to imagine these paintings take a long time to paint, and yet these motifs circulated quite quickly and effectively without the benefit of easily reproduced art. On this Dutch market, new motifs multiplied in pictures by different artists, and they also strayed into other genres, as it turned out. My favorite, and it's the one I started with all those years ago, is a seemingly innocuous motif. It is the opened mouth with an ostentatious rack of teeth, where someone stares out at you. Dentistry in the 17th century wasn't very sophisticated. So you can imagine this was actually a little bit of an uncouth motif, and it was a bit, so it shows up in these comic paintings that I was studying all this time. And it shows up in the 1620s, really for the first time extensively in the history of art. First in Hendrik ter Bruggen and then in Frans Hals, kind of at the same time in 1625 or so. And then one of our most famous Dutch artists, Rembrandt, starts using it like this. He puts it on a beggar, on himself. He's actually that self-portrait in both cases on the left in these etchings. And then even on the suffering Christ in a totally different context, but it's the same kind of motif. It's become a popular motif. And it works. And then, why not? Adrian Brouwer takes up the idea. He takes it up a level or a level up or down, depending on your taste. I realized that, he particularly looks as if he just took a big swig of lemon juice, but that is not really the point. I think he's actually drinking a medicine. The point I'm trying to make is that these open mouths in these paintings are in totally different contexts, but created in a very dense geographic area of cities, and they have nothing to do with each other, besides each offering a striking bit of expression that must have fascinated viewers and sold. An eye-catching motif like that enabled painters to deploy it flexibly and show their capacities as innovators who knew the latest fashions and could provide you. And such positioning was necessary in the dense market of Holland. This art market was a tale of fast-growing cities and circulation of ideas, competitive circulation of ideas. It was a larger and less centralized market than earlier art markets, and much more diversified in its mechanisms of exchange. In the olden days, you had the church and princes and kings and potentates ordering art bespoke of court artists or church artists and so forth. Not so in the 17th century Netherlands. This market, this art market, emerged in a prosperous Protestant society where the use of images, the traditional use of images in Catholic worship was no longer allowed, for better or worse. And the church was no longer a major patron. It was also a market shaped by a rising mercantile and artisanal class, not one determined by the needs of kings and aristocrats. This market, then, is a tale of many cities, indeed. And artists made pictures about it. It had hardball dealers, protectionist professional societies, evolving guilds, sycophantic studio visitors. It featured price tracking, down-market auctioneering, and wild speculation, not just in tulips. There was tendentious art criticism to be found and shameless self-promotion. And interestingly, there was also something for all pocketbooks. It was a variegated market where even relatively poor people could afford a print. It was, in other words, the first modern art market in the West. It had lower barriers to entry, both for artists and for customers, but it also made it harder for artists to monopolize a market segment, as, say, a court painter could do. In fact, the court painter Peter Paul Rubens, whom you may have heard about, who worked mostly in the courts of Europe, had the corner on that market, but it was a particular kind of market and not, it was kind of a patronage market rather than a relatively open art market where most people could enter. This new market that was emerging from the late 16th century forward nurtured an open field of painting against which this silver dish or the opened mouth could be contoured as the latest tropes, the latest devices, the latest thing you had to sort of have and know about. And this market then, because it is so variegated, offers no singular explanations for the invention or the resonance of particular motifs. A certain pliability of what these things mean or why they're there, a pliability of interpretation, in other words, could arise around them. These things don't have to mean one thing. In fact, it is better for artists if they don't, if they have a certain openness around them. Market feedback loops, we all know about market feedback loops, right? Market feedback loops may tell painters what people want, but they do not determine why people may want it. A lot of the time, artists didn't necessarily know who was going to own their work. Again, this is a modern feature of that market. And this indeterminacy was really a boon to ambitious painters like Rembrandt, who could use a theme like the opened mouth in different ways. He could advance his own interest in making art that had new expressive force. He was a relentless innovator. But he could also get paid for it at the same time and, using his own face in this case, promote his skills to potential customers. Throughout Dutch art production in the 17th century, we see this happening. We see these market preferences and specializations and sudden motifs arise and emerge in a modern system of painting where artists where the artists really strive to maintain creative autonomy, but also gain market share. Genres of painting, styles of painting, and motifs, even techniques, were established rapidly often, building on product or process innovations by one or two pioneers, maybe, that you can identify, but then were quickly caught on and would morph further as people took them up. Part 2, the lure of the lemon. In the 1620s, the lemon was a fast rising star in still life, and it had staying power. Like the opened mouth, it moved promiscuously between genres, though still life remained its home. Amazingly, the lemon has not disappeared from Western still life since the Dutch put it there 4 centuries ago. I'm going to try to show that to you. But first, what accounts for the rise of the lemon, and particularly the peeled one in still life? The omnipresence of the motif suggests that no singular explanation can be considered causal. I've already suggested that. This is a feedback loop kind of market where things arise. It appears that lemons became objects of pictorial fascination because they engaged 3 tightly entwined interests and sites of innovation in the Dutch Republic, this society of the 17th century. These 3 interests were commerce, natural history, and painting. Before the lemon arrived at this significant nexus of botany, horticulture, trade, and art, however, it had already become a species of obsessive scientific inquiry. I use the word advisedly, obsessive scientific inquiry in Italy. These studies proceeded at the first modern scientific organization, you could say, known as the Academy of the Lynxes, which was founded in Rome in 1603 and eventually organized around Galileo, the great astronomer. And the Academy indeed a version of it exists to this day, and this is its motto. As the presence of this great observational astronomer Galileo suggests, this group of scientists that organized themselves had high confidence in visual observation. Indeed, they took their mascot, which is the lynx, in reference to the sharp eyesight of that cat. They were the Academy of the Lynxes, the sharp-eyed ones, the perceptive ones. And the data master among them all was an antiquarian and natural history buff named Cassiano dal Pozzo, who you see here in a beautiful engraving. And Cassiano was a polymath, you could say, and a great collector. And he conceived of a very ambitious project to have these academicians chart the entire world of natural wonders and cultural antiquities through drawings that he intended to publish in what he called a paper museum. The paper museum was going to include many albums, many publications on fungi, fossilized woods, stones and shells, antiquities, works of art, inscriptions from the olden days, and of course, citrus. He intended to publish all these drawings that he was commissioning and working on with this group, but remember, he was an academic, and his aspirations sometimes exceeded what he could deliver. So in fact, they weren't actually published until recently, under the leadership of David Friedberg, this historian I mentioned from Columbia, who gave that long talk about citrus fruit, because he actually edited this volume of the paper museum of Cassiano dal Pozzo and the Academy of the Lynxes on citrus. Now, why citrus? The complexity of the citrus family was grist to the mill of the Lynxes, these academicians. They produced dozens, several hundred drawings of citrus fruits. Primarily one man did so, named Vincenzo Leonardi, but there were others in there, and they did so to get a handle on the principles that underlie the baffling variety of citrus fruits that they could find in the markets and in the orangeries and nurseries of Italy. At the time, citrus fruits were definitely understood to be related to each other, but the Lynxes wanted to find out why that was and how. And they believed that if you just drew lots of individual fruits that seemed akin to each other but different, that somehow a system of resemblance would emerge, a system of resemblance and differentiation that could help you grasp the full range and all the transformations of the citrus clan into all these families and siblings and so forth. Now that confidence in the power of making a picture of something represented a shift in natural history. Whereas in the Renaissance, scholars had usually slotted objects into taxonomies, by saying this looks like that, therefore it must be more or less the same and related, and they often grouped things together with other objects that came from wildly different realms of nature or culture. This was a change. What the Lynxes believed, they had faith that if they would not just look at the external resemblance, which was the old mode of putting things together in a chamber of curiosities, if you just would draw the innards as well as the skins of thousands of natural objects in related classes, that they could somehow encompass the possible forms of the entire natural world in a paper museum, and then begin to draw out the connections among them. To give you a sense of the difference, imagine in the olden days, maybe in the 12th century, someone would say, well, here's an egg, and that egg actually looks an awful lot in shape like this stone, and here's this shell. They must all have something in common, some inner principle that motivates them. You could even say a mathematical principle, I guess, but that's not what they were after, actually. They were really sort of saying these things are sort of related beings. And so the difference is that the Lynxes are saying, no, look at all these crazy fruits. They all look a little bit different from each other. We're drawing them, we're cutting them open, we're sectioning them, we're looking at their skins inside and out, and we're going to just see that we're going to keep drawing. And so when you do that, you may have to keep drawing forever, of course. And this meant, of course, that indeed their faith that pictures could somehow produce an organized taxonomy of the natural world was doomed to fail. When you have anomalies like this one, for example, this digitated, sort of misshapen citron or etrog, or you have these curious kinds of concoctions, the sour orange grafted onto a citron. If you have that kind of variety, just drawing citron after citron, after lemon after lemon, after lemon after lemon, after grapefruit, after pomelo, and so forth, it only makes it harder to come to a stable taxonomy. You end up drowning in data. And this challenge, when natural history began to deal with this in the course of the 17th and 18th century, confirmed that the route to botanic taxonomy would not be by drawing and resemblance alone. And a century later, of course, Linnaeus would effect a monumental change in our conception of the natural world by categorizing the plant kingdom according to reproductive parts and mechanisms. That is the basis still of botany today, although we do it somewhat differently today in the genomics revolution. But in a way, just their cutting it open sets botany on this part to figure out that you need to look on the inside and not just the outside. Okay. Does the pictorial cataloging of citrus fruits that these Roman guys were doing have anything to do with lemons in Dutch still life, where they appear outside the context of natural history? Cassiano's project certainly shows that there was keen contemporary interest in citrus as an object of optical scrutiny, of observation. Citrus fruits, I'm sure you know this, are a cultivated fruit. They are not found in all their differentiation in the wild, really. And although citrus from Asia had been known in Europe since the Middle Ages, Renaissance courts and the new botanical gardens that were being built from the 16th century forward and associated with universities, they went crazy about citrus fruit when it came essentially from China, probably Iran as well. And they began to build orangeries in the north to nurture the self-preserving, tasty and healthful fruits through the colder months. And so you see here two images of a Dutch orangery which is really like a wintering house where you bring the plants inside, you treat them through the winter, you warm it even, and then you sort of force the plants to grow a little faster, and you bring them outside in the summer, and you can do whatever you want with them, and especially eat them. But what I'm calling attention to is that the lemon was cultivated. It was known to be something that needed care and attention, especially in the north. And in this sense, the lemon was a product of human artifice, every bit as much as the objects of metalwork, porcelain, and glassware on the still life table where you find them together, as in this painting by Kolff. In painting, the diligence involved in crafting both natural and artificial specimens, this diligence that it takes to get a lemon ripe, or to make these beautiful objects that are painted. In painting, these painters are really replaying that same diligence, that same artifice. The word curiosity is associated with that practice and was at the time. As a wonderful art historian named Christopher Wood, who's at NYU in New York, in the German department actually, as Christopher Wood has shown, the word curiosity implies the exotic wonder of objects like this to viewers and users at the time, but it also implied this diligence, this sustained care in creating or rendering such things. Dutch still life paintings, like this one by Kolff, who is one of the greatest of these painters, Dutch still life paintings relish the careful differentiation of citrus fruits among other luxuries. And their play of light, for example, they pay a lot of attention to. I'll give you a little detail. Look at how there in the vessel you have this lemon reflected. This sort of play and diligence is just extraordinary and lavish just as much on these fruits as it is on the other fine objects. Scientific interest in citrus certainly ran high in Holland. These drawings I'd shown you by Leonardi and the Lynx, they had an afterlife in Europe in a delightful manual on citrus that was published in 1646 in Rome. And this book on the cultivation, the trade, and the culinary and the hygienic and the medicinal uses of citrus, this little Roman book was known to Dutch botanists and horticulturalists. Indeed, in 1676, about 30 years later, Jan Commelen, who was one of the founders of the Amsterdam Botanical Garden at the time, he used that very manual as the basis for his book called The Dutch Garden of the Hesperides. I show you the title page here, The Dutch Garden of the Hesperides. And it is a great book on everything lemon and orange and citron that you ever wanted to know, and more. And the title is interesting. You may know, if you're a classically trained person or even read a book from time to time, that the Garden of the Hesperides was an imaginary mythical garden of the classical world, thought to be somewhere in Morocco or West Africa. And the Dutch garden was thought to be, the Garden of the Hesperides was thought to be a garden of golden apples that was protected by a dragon that only Hercules was managed to slay. And because the apples were golden, it was thought that they should surely have been oranges. And this was a long history of talking about this. And so when he calls this the Dutch Garden of the Hesperides, he's talking about that connection between fruits from the south, fruits from the Mediterranean, from warmer places, and how you can grow them and cultivate them in the Netherlands. He says many mournful things about how terrible the climate is and how hard it is, but he encourages people to stick with it so they can have these wonderful fruits. Now, Commelen's book, the reason I mention it is that look at these drawings. Do they look familiar, or rather these engravings? Commelen's book included 26 illustrations like this, and many of them were engraved immediately after the citrus drawings that this Academy of the Lynxes had produced. So this work was known. Its publication in 1676 was a landmark moment for the cultivation of citrus fruit in the Netherlands and for their extended uses. Great uses that you can read about. It's very entertaining to read. In medicines, in scented sachets for your linen closet, in perfumes, in pastilles, in flavored brandies, or in sherbets. But note the date. The book was published in 1676, so it is too late really to have had an influence on our still life painters. Rather, it seems to respond to the same interest in citrus fruit that these painters display. By 1676, the eyes of artists and their customers had long been trained on citrus in the Netherlands, and particularly on the lemon and the common orange, which was also known as the apple of China. And now let's look at those paintings, because really, after the early 1630s, there didn't seem to be a 17th century banquet piece that didn't have citrus fruit in it, especially lemons. We'll just look at a bunch of them. Here's Hader, you've seen it before. Peter Klaas. Jan Janszoon den Uyl, with a very curiously twisted peel. Jan Davidszoon de Heem, perhaps my favorite. He was an elegant calligrapher of the peel. You always feel the peel is longer than it really could possibly be. Jan van der Velde, who left the fruit whole, a restrained guy. And then Willem Kalf, who was also, as you can see, an orange man. And then you had just an absolutely unending parade of anonymous painters like this, working cheap and cheerful. Can you tell the difference a little bit in quality of the work? What is striking about all this citrus, however, in Dutch still life painting, is that it is pretty much all of a kind. We get what Commelin called the common white lemon and the common sour orange. These are the two you really see in most Dutch still life paintings. In still life, we don't get this sort of fun that those guys in Rome were all about. You know, the mottled blood orange on the left, or sprays of mandarins, or digitated, pregnant grapefruits and things like that. You don't get the differentiation that fascinated the Academy of the Lynxes. And I think it would be wrong to think of citrus in still life paintings as a tool of natural history. No one really learns about lemons from these paintings. You can learn about how they are painted. You can, for botany, I recommend you just Google it. I think you'd learn more. There is an interesting fact about this uniformity of lemons and oranges in still life, however. It does suggest a thoroughgoing standardization of citrus on the Dutch market for this exotic fruit. This is what painters could get. This is what their customers knew. How did the lemon become such a trope in the damp, cool north that was no natural habitat for citrus? How did it get there? Could twin scientific interest and commercial availability of these fruits somehow account for the proliferation of the peeled lemon in still life? I still didn't have my answer. But let me say something about how it gets there, because people tend to ask a lot of questions about it. The history of fruit trade shows that citrus had been a rare and hyper-expensive Mediterranean import in the Netherlands in the later Middle Ages, in the 14th, 15th century. And it was usually came to people in confectioned or salted forms, or it would have rotted before it got there. Counts and dukes were the only people who could afford paying 8 guilders for 4 oranges. 8 guilders was the equivalent of about the monthly salary of a well-trained carpenter, 4 oranges. By 1600, however, this picture was changing dramatically, thanks to the rise of Dutch cities and an unparalleled mercantile fleet, along with a middle class that had disposable income. Led by the Botanical Garden of Leiden, the gardens of Holland in the 17th century quickly became active centers of cultivation, experimentation, and commerce. It was usually for a commercial end. These were Dutch gardens. Of all the exotic taste sensations then that flooded Dutch markets in the 17th century and that we hear about, the great spices, the nutmegs, and so forth, citrus fruit became more common and more affordable than most. Boatloads of trees with their root balls carefully packed in soil and moss. This book talks all about that. They were shipped from Genoa to the Dutch Republic, where they could be wintered in these orangeries I already showed you. These are also illustrations from that book I mentioned, where they could be wintered and brought out in the summer, and where a tree might yield, as this author tells us, as many as 50 to 100 fruits at a picking. The fruit had become rather common, even though it had still a whiff of luxury around it. Paintings of social rituals. The Dutch painted lots of pictures of social rituals in the 17th century. It's wonderful. And those paintings track the Dutch domestication of Mediterranean citrus. In 1665, this painter van der Neer painted an elegant young woman who is offering orange and lemon slices on this dish. Orange and lemon, the sweet and the sour, to an unseen companion. It's a little scene of courtship. She is herself, as you can see, a study in variegated orange. I think it's intentional. A similar coloristic riff, this time yellow, structures this picture by Gerard ter Borch, another great social life painter, where you see a young woman and her courier make lemonade out of lemons. At the heart of this composition, ter Borch played out the yellow theme with great finesse. Just as the lemon rind swirls through the liquid, materials in yellow and ochre, the clothes that they're wearing, revolve around the glass. It's almost a still life painting of people when you look at it. Now, the compositional thoughtfulness of these two painters, and there are many examples I could give you, but you're clearly thinking about color and how that citrus fits there. It suggests that they painted citrus fruits not just because they were a hot commodity, or because, as in these cases, they offered a ready pun on the sweet and sour pangs of love. People love thinking like that. There's more to it for painters. The naturally saturated, bright colors of oranges and lemons appear to have become a special challenge and delight for painters in this time and their customers. And I think one can understand it. In an age before electric light or wide availability of bright synthetic pigments, the sunny fruit with shiny rinds and juicy flesh could seem to shine on its own, as it does in this picture. In the cool light of the north, or at the darkening end of the winter days, they glowed in the way still life paintings seem to say that they do. There was a tradition in Netherlandish painting, an old tradition, of cherishing this warming effect of Mediterranean fruit. 2 centuries before our still life painters got going with their lemons, Jan van Eyck of Bruges had already used citrus fruit to this effect in his famous Arnolfini wedding portrait, a picture you may know. And usually people look at the gestures and the people in the mirror, but I, of course, was interested in the oranges. You become a little obsessed yourself with these things. Is it far-fetched to bring Van Eyck up here? This painting would not have been known in its particular form to these painters I'm talking about, and that's not what I'm saying. But here's a little bit of art historical arcane knowledge that I do want to share. Jan van Eyck, in the 15th century, became known as the inventor of oil painting. Up to the time he was painting, most painting was based on chalks, as in fresco, or egg tempera and so forth, and didn't have that shiny quality that lets you mimic the optical effects of the world in the way that, obviously he did so brilliantly, right? And so although I think, again, he did not invent oil paint, it probably was an emergent practice, a studio practice where people were riffing off of each other. I still think the fact that he was known as the inventor of oil painting, even in this time, had a truth to it, because no one really did it better after him in some ways, at least this sort of thing. And so I think that a lot of his pictures, there were versions of them around or these ideas, and so I think it is not crazy to think that with accidental details like this, so carefully done, Van Eyck began to give the still life painters who came long after him some of their assignments, or that they sort of hearkened back to that idea. In this picture, for example, the Lucca Madonna of 1436, Van Eyck sort of stretches from left to right on either side of the Virgin and Child. He stretches across contrasts of form, of color, of translucency and reflectivity that would become fundamental to still life painting. Balancing 2 oranges at the left periphery, you see them there. If you see on the left here, you see on the left, he balances the oranges there against this sort of little still life on the right with brass and glass in a way that really brings to mind still life painting for me of the 17th century across the pictorial field. He set off these wonderful wonders to look at, these visual treats and delights, against a sort of beige monochrome that unifies his picture and lets your eye rest a little bit so you can take it all in. And he does that as well as any Dutch painter would do it 2 centuries hence. Here, Peter Claes, of course, very deliberately chosen for this purpose. Now, back to the larger story. Still life artists outside the Netherlands also took up the fruit. You may ask what happened elsewhere. And they did it with relish as a resource and a challenge. Some, like this guy, Jacob van Hulsdonk of Antwerp, overdid it a little, I would say, loading up his picture with lemons and oranges and bursting open a lush pomegranate for contrast. But eventually, almost every great painter in the still life tradition would make citrus an object of study. They all take it on. In Spain, to be fair, Juan Sanchez Cotan pioneered the power of lemons before the Dutch. This is a very early picture, as you can see, 1603, I think. And in Spain also, at the same time as these Dutch painters, or a little later, the fantastic Zurbarán achieved a rare blend of description and mathematical organization in his treatment of these fruits, and especially the lemons. Others will be coming to mind as you think about it. You will see them everywhere now. Every time you go to a museum, it's gonna kill you. You will only see lemons and oranges. Chardin, for example, the 18th century painter from France who loved the Dutch painters. But interestingly, he didn't peel the lemon as often as I had expected. It slowly goes out of fashion a little bit. Van Gogh, beautiful. Cézanne, Gauguin. Even in the dark north again, Mikhail Larionov. That surprised me a little bit, early Russian modernist painter. And of course you will have thought of probably Matisse. Matisse who loved color. This still life of 1915, of which the reproduction is not very good, apologies for that. This still life of 1915 that Matisse painted is actually a copy. It restructures, it takes a while to see it. It restructures a faithful copy that he had painted in 1893 of this picture by Jan de Heem, which is in the Louvre. He copied it in the Louvre. But then look, so he first copied it himself, and then years and years later, when he'd become this great modernist painter, in modernist fashion, he went back to it and painted the whole thing. And Matisse's later painting, now you see here is, I told you he's the calligrapher among them. And there you have Matisse doing it. And look what happens to the lemon peel in modern painting. He edits out, in his later version, de Heem's ostentatiously curled lemon peel twisting off the body of the revealed fruit. The curlicue is still there in Matisse, but if I hadn't told you where it was, you might have thought de Heem's winding peel had become the rind of a melon or the rim of a bowl. It's flattened out the way the painting in that time did. I could go on and show you lemons and oranges and limes and everything else through the most recent art of our time, from Andy Warhol to Chris O'Feely, and even, I learned, the luxury business has cottoned on to the lure of the lemon. This is from December 2019. My husband had picked this out of a journal and he showed it to me. I thought he was shopping for Christmas, but he actually wanted to show me the lemons. Now, of the citrus family, the lemon appears to have had the greatest traction, the greatest appeal, more so than oranges, statistically for sure, to still life painters. Perhaps because it stood out spectacularly against the darkest hues, as you see here, or because its high-keyed color in lead tin yellow paint was challenging to integrate into a composition. Remember how Van Eyck tries to blend those oranges in and soften them. The yellow can scream, so you have to be very sophisticated in nuancing that color range. But most great Western painters, even if they liked the lemon, did not pursue the signature invention of Dutch still life, the artfully dangling, twisting and curling, unbroken peel. As these virtuoso specimens by Coffin Hater show, the inner lemon had so much to offer the painter. Rind and pith together, the yellow and the white, showed the lemon yellow, this kind of color, closeness to, and yet distinction from white. Against green, red, and blue of the carpet, the yellow and the white leapt out. And as a complex, irregular spiral, the peel could generate a subtle sense of depth if the painter was competent enough to solve this difficult problem of perspectival coherence. We've seen that not all painters do it right, or do a great job of it. And that is why Heda put that shadow there that fascinated me as a child. And opened up, the lemon offered yet more surfaces for the painter to paint. Great! Still life painters are all about painting surfaces in interesting shapes and textures. So the dissected lemon became a sort of miniature still life within the still life, offering capricious curl and near circular section, nubby opaqueness outside, glassy translucency within, highest lights and deep shadows to manifest movement and depth. And those qualities could then be contrasted with minute painterly nuance to the objects painted nearby, ever shinier, ever more transparent, ever nubbier, and so on. And painters want you to notice. They do it on purpose. In this still life by Den Uyl, for example, we are pressed as viewers to discern the distinction between lemon rind and bread roll. That's a bread roll right there. That's the lemon rind. They're painted with near identical but differentiated pigment mixes and techniques. So, a short last section. I still haven't told you who invented the lemon twist. Does anyone want to guess? I gave you a lot of names. They're hard to remember. And I sort of should have said you shouldn't worry too much. Let's look. Where did painters get this idea of stripping the lemon but leaving the peel on and putting it on a table? In one way, putting fruit that has been cut open into pictures appears related to these researchers of the scientists in Rome who drew citrus inside out for the first time. At least as a scientific matter. It had been done before, as we'll see. Cassiano's researchers dissected lemons and oranges to enable the academics to study their innards, count their seeds, and narrate their digitations, their pregnancies, and their other marvels. Dutch lemon peel painters registered this shift toward the interior study of life forms. You can see them doing it and reacting to it. But botanical scientists never, as far as I know, drew them peeled in the manner that Dutch painters do. I believe now that the origin narrative, the genesis of the peeled still life lemon, goes something like this. Painters of Mary and the Christ Child in the Renaissance had long included citrus fruits cut open, as you see here on the table before Mary and Christ, with a knife to book, and especially varieties that were then known as Adam's apple oranges. The name of that orange, Adam's apple, and its presence in pictures like this refers to the belief that Mary and Jesus had come into the world to redeem the original sin of Eve and Adam. But when you look at citrus sections like this, they are really ciphers rather than diligent observational studies, the way we've seen our painters do them. When citrus, about almost a century later, became a staple of the middle-class table around 1610 in the Netherlands, still life painters like this guy, Nicolas Gillis, cut citrus basically the same way, including for ease, again, a knife. So you have here something that looks like a cross between a grapefruit and an orange. I'm not sure he looked too close at it. Surely such artistic interest in the interior fruit was supported by the practice of botanical drawing that we have already seen. And there's some further connections perhaps there to the peel. At the Habsburg court of Prague, which had a very significant scientific and artistic culture, science and art really flourishing in an integrated way around 1600, this artist, one of my favorites, Joris Hoefnagel, added his very fine study of a sour orange to a page of a calligraphic album that was drawn by another artist. Beautiful, right? With the snail and the flowers and the seeds. It is as if in still life painting, the flourishes of this calligrapher dangling down and Hoefnagel's botanical observations somehow come together in the lemon's trailing, twisting peel. It's far-fetched to be sure, but what I'm trying to call your attention to is the decorative attraction rather than the botanical uses of the lemon peel to the artist. Because the invention of the motif was in the end a painterly affair rather than a scientific experiment or a culinary recipe. Peeling a lemon in this particular way is not intuitive. I have tried. I encourage you to do it. Be careful, don't cut yourself. It is not easy. What is not easy is keeping the peel whole and making sure it doesn't pull the fruit off the table once you've done that. It's a feat of dexterity. So an aware viewer at the time might have equated that accomplishment of peeling with the painter's manual skill. There's a certain self-consciousness in the reference. But where did the idea come from to do it? Of course, there were lemon rinds, but again, to leave it on like that, that's what is fascinating. The lemon rinds were cured all the time and put in puddings and so forth. I believe that the idea to represent the product of this action in paint may have been prompted by a little domestic ritual that survives in the country to this day. And that is of keeping an apple peel whole by moving a knife around the fruit in unbroken movement. I remember my mother doing that for us and telling us then to throw it over our shoulders, and the letter that it would make would be of a person thinking of us just then. Some others of you may know this tradition. And wouldn't you know it, the Dutch painters painted. This girl, in a painting by Pieter de Hoog from about 1665 or so, seems to be standing there admiring her mom for this skill and hoping, as I always was, that I would get to toss the peel. So there was a tradition of this peeling, and once I thought about that, I found it in still life. Floris van Dijk appears to have introduced such a dexterously peeled apple in still life in the early 16 teens, about 10 years before my story gets going, letting it dangle off the table into our space, as you can see, quite in the way, the apple is not there, but you just see it's quite in the way that the lemon is going to do it later. And in these pictures too, the paring knife is always at hand. Sometimes, of course I was hoping I would find him doing it with a lemon, but he doesn't. Sometimes Van Dijk associated the apple peel with lemon sections. He even puts them together. Look, there are the lemon sections, there's the apple peel. The whole thing begins to come together. The dish looks like it's going to crash into our laps, but you know, he's getting there. But he stopped short of peeling a lemon in paint. Having studied hundreds of these pictures, I have concluded that that idea was probably the brainchild of Pieter Claes, who moved from Antwerp to Haarlem. Haarlem, the hometown of the painter who peeled the apples, and he moves there around 1621, about 10 years after that motif was invented. Claes truly seems to have been the first to transpose the apple peel conceit onto lemon. From 1621 to 1629, many of his paintings are dated. His paintings virtually track the process of invention. So the art historian later on can track it back. At the time, of course, these pictures go into the world, but we can track it now. So here, there is a sour orange with the knife, inviting us to imagine it's sectioned. What's going to happen with that knife and that orange? And the painter soon obliged, 2 years later or so, with another orange. He cut it in half, the way we've seen others do in paint. Then, in 1625, he peeled the entire rind of one lemon and puts it on that dish there. And he left only 2 slices of the fruit to which it had belonged. You see that here. You see, there's the rind. And then the dish that protrudes again beyond the table edge ostentatiously reflects the second lemon that's kept whole. It's as if the whole process of creation has been laid bare for you, but it's still not going over the edge. Over the next couple of years, Claes varied these motifs in refined pictures like this one from 1627. You see again a very creative sort of peeling of the lemon on the dish. By then, he also sometimes curled the peel itself off the table, the way he might have seen in the apple paintings before. And before the Roaring Twenties were over. These are still kind of cacophonous, ostentatious paintings, but before the Roaring Twenties were over, Claes had learned to mute the coloristic spectacle into monochrome subtleties worthy of Van Eyck. The better to let the bright lemons and their sinuous peels speak for themselves. They become the thing, more than all the rest in the painting. And after he had accomplished that, over the arc of a career that would run for 30 more years, I'm sorry to say he did a lot more of them, but mostly they're very good, and he mastered a full repertoire of the motif, integrating compositional, coloristic, and textural skill. Now, although Claes almost certainly made the most deliberate contributions to the establishment of the lemon peel as the trademark of tabletop paintings, he didn't do it alone quite. He appears to have developed the device in collaborative rivalry with his peers. You can have collaborative rivalry, including colleagues in his native Antwerp. Ultimately then, although I think I have found the original lemon twister in Claes, pinpointing a single originator for any popular motif on the early modern market of Holland is not especially fruitful, pun intended. I've already said that. It is such a lively back and forth culture that we have here. In this thriving urban economy, fashions arose through feedback loops among artists, buyers, and intermediaries, such as print publishers and art dealers. The rise of these very sophisticated memes, from the still life banquet itself to the taza that fell over or the lemon, was an emergent phenomenon. The theory of emergence is very helpful here, rather than some top-down strategy driven by single artists or guilds or customers, even if some painters were nimbler in establishing or owning signature contributions than others. The interactive dynamic in the development of motifs can at last be discerned in the evolution of the lemon peel after Claes invented it for painting. Look at this. Remember for a second this painting from 1629, Peter Claes. Here is Willem Heda, same year, 1629, which I think is the first time he does this. He seems to have followed the lead of his younger peer in this same town of Haarlem. He thrusts the peel forward just a little, as Claes had been doing. But then Heda really runs with it. And by 1635, Heda had developed a monumental mode of still life in which long dangling peels play critical balancing roles or pivoting parts in his compositions. This is the painting that grabbed me when I was an 11-year-old girl. And these bolder moves and these big paintings appear to have provoked Claes, for his part, to push his later lemons farther over the edge. There they go, as in his still life with taza from 1636, a year later. The presence of the tipped silver dish here, which had, you may remember from the beginning, it had been an invention of Heda, the other artist, may indicate this reversal of transmission by this point, where Heda becomes the more powerful artistic personality, perhaps, pushing this on Claes. Between 1628 and 1633, when Heda and others picked up on Claes's studies, the curling lemon rind became an indelible trope, remaining viable for at least a century in the Netherlands and beyond, even though artists hardly ever twisted the peels in precisely the same way. That was my big surprise. I thought they would all be the same. A culture of botanical connoisseurship probably fostered inquiry into the characteristics of citrus fruits, as I've said, but for painters, the interest was primarily aesthetic and commercial. It was an imperative for them. Like the products of the new natural history and the treasures of global Dutch trade, pictorial innovations proliferated and morphed in this society that valued observational knowledge and that really craved novelty. And these novelties were made available on these urban markets, overflowing with curiosities and works of art. The lemon helped you stand out in such a space. Moving in endless variation across still life, the lemon peel became an animating force in Dutch pictorial culture, well beyond the genre of still life. I already showed you a few of those pictures of courtship. And here, in this compilation of details from 4 different paintings by my beloved Jan Steen, the comic painter, you see the motif turning up again and again, enlivening the comic scene, his comic scenes, This is the image you may have seen on the poster. There it is, there it is, there it is, there it is. It turns up everywhere, just as a little bit of interest. And to say, I am a sponge, I can do this, I can bring this in and get it back out at you. I told you he was a relentless thief of ideas. He stole the idea and ran with it again and again, and many other painters did. So, as a warranty of Dutch painting of banquets and everyday life, the twist ensured citrus its storied afterlife in the history of still life painting to this day, even as its ostentatious spirals in and out of depth lost its appeal for modern artists, as we saw in Motifs. Now we mostly get our lemons whole. So my study of the history of the peeled lemon in paint, I think, is finished for the time being. What I have done with it so far, I think I could have done more efficiently, better, and certainly with more pleasure if I had been in a position to be in a university like this. And if I had been in a position to collaborate more directly than I already did. I did to some degree with botanists, with art conservators who know materials, with artists, with philosophers, with economists, with historians and anthropologists. And Abu Dhabi affords, I think, all of us, scholars, students, and the public, that power of differential knowledge that can be brought together in the lab to learn together and come up with great new creative ideas like the peeled lemon. And this is what I wanted to tell you. And it is one of the reasons that I am so incredibly happy to be back in this institution with all of you. Thank you.